as many know, the first Five Nights at Freddy's game, in regards to its story, had very little to go off of, relying solely on either the person on the phone directly or certain Easter eggs that helped shape the overall narrative. Like, sure, there were a few newspaper clippings, each with a literal 1% chance of occasionally showing up in your game, with an absurd amount of spelling errors too, but that was kind of it. Which, with how the series eventually developed, had to be expanded in some sort of way, right? What is that? Early on, specifically in FNAF 2, the player would encounter one of 4 different minigames, randomly after a failed attempt at a night. From then on, the series had at least one 8-bit minigame per new installment, with small similarities and differences in each one, and sometimes a lot. I'd say that over time, this became literally one of the most iconic aspects of the series, to the way it captured key parts of the story, was implemented in the gameplay, and of course how they visually evolved over time. And honestly, I feel it's kind of overlooked in a sense. So why not revisit essentially every single arcade minigame in the series, which is now ranging close to a 10-year lifespan, good god, and show how each one artistically evolved as the series progressed. Kinda skipping over the lore behind each one, everybody's already kinda talked about that. There's quite a lot here, obviously, if you haven't noticed, so bear with me. Like I mentioned before, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 has 4 minigames that you can only play randomly after a death. It's no secret that these death minigames, as they're called, are meant to emulate the style of the majority of popular Atari 2600 titles, down to the 8-bit graphics, lack of any real detail, and a blinding CRT filter, which I'd say works pretty well at capturing those same limitations of the Atari console's hardware. In fact, not sure if this is just a coincidence or not, but the credited co-founder of Atari, Nolan Bushnell, also founded Chuck E. Cheese. Nonetheless, the contrast of your day-to-day office gameplay switching to an uncanny Atari-styled minigame makes it feel like you're playing something that you're clearly not supposed to be.
Oh, what is that? What is this? Oh, what is this?
One element that's just so iconic to FNAF 2's minigames are, of course, the visuals, and honestly, how strange they all look.
Holy God, what are you showing me?
While it's hard to make out in the minigames themselves, due to the, again, strong CRT filter plastered on top of them, when you get an actual good look at some of these characters individually, you can start to see what I mean. Practically every single sprite throughout the entire series is actually not your traditional pixel art, with it seemingly being built upon a bunch of awkwardly placed squares and rectangles. While it's down to speculation as to why this was actually done, it's believed that Scott had rendered these in his usual 3D modeling software, being Autodesk 3ds Max, rather than using ClickTeam directly to make the pixel art, which, let's just say, makes a lot more sense when you look at them. It also means these aren't technically 8-bit, but look, that's what they're called in the file, just give me a break. Honestly, this weird style gives them a really distinct look that just can't be captured in your typical pixel art. Trust me, I've tried, it just doesn't look the same. With by far the most popular being Man. That's this guy's actual name in the file, just Man, that's it. Introduced in this Save Them minigame is literally the first time we see the series' main antagonist, who was, at the time, properly coined with the name Purple Guy. Take a guess why. Throughout his different depictions in the series, this specific sprite from this specific minigame remains undoubtedly his most popular. And I personally think that's simply due to how much detail is packed in this strange-looking man. Fitted with a crooked neck, large smile, creepy eyes, and a yellow badge, this one individual sprite representing the main villain of, at the time, the first 2 games worked surprisingly well, even if I still can't tell what he's supposed to be holding. But this certainly wasn't the first time Scott Cawthon has ever done this in one of his games. The Frog's Quest minigame from Chipper & Sons Lumber Co., being a game Scott developed and released a year before the original Five Nights at Freddy's, has a look that does strongly resemble FNAF 2's death minigames, especially strange when the other minigames here all more so align with the look of the actual game. Like, this is the only one that looks like this, it's never explained, doesn't help the player, and is pretty rare to get in general. Later on in Scott Cawthon's Fighter Mage Bard, this mixed with the added CRT-like lines and glow effect on the sprites, which albeit wasn't even the first time these were present, would eventually culminate in an Atari-like style that I guess stuck with Scott for the Five Nights at Freddy's series, which is admittedly pretty strange for him. As Scott has expressed a couple times in either interviews or general messages, he's essentially an exclusive Nintendo fanboy, namely being big fans of games like Super Metroid and Mega Man 3. While both have definitely inspired games set further in the series, they have very little to do with FNAF 2's specific minigames, which all in all is kind of funny in retrospect. Another aspect that surprisingly really hasn't been used again in the series are the minigame sound effects. Easily the most iconic soundbite from these minigames here are the specific enunciated spellings of save them, help them, and save him. The sound bites themselves obviously sound extremely choppy, which seem to have come from, this thing.
Dummy.
This, mixed with incredibly loud static and lack of any actual sound effects, besides some confetti for some reason, all works to create an unnerving way to build upon the first game's story. Or, again, lack thereof, spelling errors. For the series' third entry, things take a bit of a different turn. Instead of being thrown into a minigame after just a random death, there are now two different sets of minigames here. One being after successfully completing each night, and the other, just click around everywhere, you'll probably get one eventually. These post-night minigames aren't too different from the Save Them one from FNAF 2, but this time, instead of controlling Freddy roaming around the FNAF 2 pizzeria, you're controlling basically everybody here, following a purple-shaded Freddy inside the first game's location with a slightly decrepit makeover. The sound design works extra hard to convey this as well. Now, I'll be honest, this is where the series starts to lose that Atari aesthetic. By making a lot of the rooms and characters more detailed in their appearances, the CRT filter being more faint, and the minigame capturing sounds that are not nearly possible in the 2600, it definitely starts to lose the style it was trying to emulate in the first place. But for some reason, this game's style specifically is by far my personal favorite from the main series. Especially the purple guy sprite, he's a lot more expressive here. But that's not all. Inside these minigames are, for the first and only time, certain clues to how to unlock the second set of minigames here, being BB's Air Adventure, Mangle's Quest, Chica's Party, Stage 01, and finally, Happiest Day. And this is where I think FNAF 3 really shines. Each minigame requires some sort of activation to enter it, which can either be as easy as clicking odd things around the building, or entering a 6-digit password on the office's wall panels. Which actually, I've never tried. Maybe that's... Oh, of course it is. Whatever, I don't care. For one, turning these arcade-style minigames into actual platformers instead of essentially just linear cutscenes makes them feel much more like actual arcade cabinets that something like Fazbear Entertainment would put inside their locations, and is also how one of the minigames is directly accessed. Which, again, going back to some of Scott's older games, might have been a source of inspiration there as well. But each one has a special twist. If players take a detour to usually just some random wall on the level, they can clip through and find themselves in a... let's just say it looks a bit different here. Usually involving crying balloon boys, dead kids, it is a FNAF game, balloon parkour, or sentient molding cupcakes, every single one, in my opinion, adds a lot to the tone that FNAF 3 is trying to present. Whether it's the emptiness of the levels, abrupt sound effects, or the faintest chimes of a kid's music box. Add on that each one can only be figured out using the steps given out from the last set of minigames, and I think you've got the perfect formula for the series going forward. Completing all of these also rewards the player with a separate ending, which, at the time, seemed to end the series for good. Very fitting for, like, a final chapter of sorts.
Say that again?
Remember when I said that FNAF 3 had the perfect minigame formula for the series going forward? Well, basically just throw all that out the window, because this one, again, decided to basically just do its own thing. Before ever even being introduced to the gameplay, we actually get our minigame first, which means these are technically pre-night minigames, sorta. Each minigame, again, before starting a night, acts as another day in the story of this small child. Whether it's being stuck in his bedroom, stuck in Fredbear's family diner, stuck in Fredbear's mouth, this little guy can't catch a break. Seriously. It's also the first time here we play as an undisclosed human character, rather than an animatronic, or at least a ghost kid possessing one. Having these minigames spread throughout different locations that are all actually connected to each other makes each day feel pretty memorable in my opinion, especially since you have to go back to the nightmare that is FNAF 4 after finishing each one. Which, honestly, also really works in these minigames' favor. While I'm 99% sure that these all don't one-to-one correlate with the main gameplay of the nights, at least now, in a way it's almost designed to trick you into thinking they actually are, with the idea that we're playing as a kid itself, minigames taking place during the day, nights obviously taking place at nights, certain dialogue choices, etc. This is something that's really never been seen before, as minigames weren't necessarily seen as taking place alongside the general gameplay. Graphically, the presentation here more aligns with how the FNAF 3 post-night minigames look, but with lots more detail. Like, a lot more detail. There's textures for grass, shadows cast on the wall, secret Easter eggs you can find scattered about, and even dialogue, which is a notable first here. There's even changes in perspective, going from the top-down angle we're used to a more straight-on 2D look when entering the diner, which I'd say is a pretty important location. Instead of human-like characters being super simplified in their designs, we've got graphics on t-shirts and even different skin tones. The music, just being this looming ambiance most of the time, also actually changes on the very last one, being the exact same music box sound loop from FNAF 3's Shadow Bonnie minigame. It's a huge departure from FNAF 2 and 3, going for a more narratively driven set of minigames rather than just delivering food to children. But that does raise the question, does FNAF 4 necessarily ruin the earlier aspect of these minigames in the series? Because if you thought FNAF 3 was losing its Atari ties, then this is a bit overboard. Not to mention that in FNAF 4's Halloween edition, that each minigame is decorated with Halloween-themed props, pumpkins, and cobwebs. Just something to brighten up the scene a bit. Which I guess is important for being the first and only one to do this. For how iconic FNAF 3's minigames became, I feel like Scott decided to differentiate this style a bit and make it more distinct rather than trying to emulate something that, already existed beforehand. Sure, there's still a CRT filter, which notably has been heavily dulled down, and hints of Atari-looking pieces, but come on, these just really aren't the same anymore. But overall, I think it's a good thing. That allowed him to further develop ideas and stories, in far greater detail, mind you, that he wanted to tell in the future. Future? I'm pretty sure he said this was the final chapter after—
What is that?
With the original release of FNAF World, the game's overworld featured a much more arcade-inspired design, being fitted inside a smaller aspect ratio and having every single character, boss, etc. in, again, that weird Scott Cawthon pixelization style, which all bordered the line of adorable to terrifying, I'm not sure. However, due to backlash upon its initial release, this style was quickly changed to something akin to what the overworld looked like in the game's first trailer, which that trailer is also gone now. However, in FNAF World's flip side, this style still remains, and even changes depending on what layer the player uncovers. With the first layer being practically identical to the original look, besides the, glowing blue Freddy and trees, the second layer is much more enclosed, puts everything in grayscale, chops Freddy's head off, and makes the trees a bit more circular, with a really disorienting effect going on with the filter. And the third layer turns both Freddy, if this really even is him anymore, and the surrounding trees into solid colors, with much slower movements. If the player continues on by smashing Freddy's head into a few walls, as one does, they'll find themselves at Old Man Consequence's lake. The whole place is blindingly red, with the appearance of the trees matching the first layer of the flip side, and Freddy being his sprite from the Deathman cutscenes, just more red. If you decide to jump in the lake for a little swim, Freddy, who I guess forgot to take swimming lessons as a kid, will sink down below for at least a couple minutes before being presented with whatever I'm looking at. It's probably either a person hugging two kids in front of a screen, or an angel, or I don't know, something. So, why did I just talk about basically everything here? None of these are technically minigames after all, except for these probably, which all look like that. Well, FNAF World, let's just say, has a lot of different styles, and I think this was a key point in how Scott wanted to portray his more information-heavy scenes, like how Duskman, Fredbear, and a bunch of other characters actually speak to the player with dialogue, or just how this game was originally going to look like this throughout the majority of the runtime. Overall, FNAF World feels like the best example of Scott Cawthon continuing to experiment with this style going forward. Well, except not immediately. In Sister Location's Circus Baby minigame, akin to FNAF 3, is, again, an actual minigame. This one is a short platformer, where Baby collects ice cream and throws it at children in a colorful grassy field, with a few upgrades along the way, for maximum throwing power. While the gameplay itself is really nothing special, like a majority of the minigames here, the step up in graphics is certainly notable for the series. Compared to the others, this one is much closer to how FNAF 4's actually looks. I mean, evolution, right? With very detailed scenery, background, and characters, even having a 2D perspective. As much as it tries to be though, this is definitely not Atari, or really even Atari inspired. The minigame itself, like I said before, is much more like FNAF 3's arcade games in its gameplay, mainly just being a relatively short platformer. Just like those, even including a little secret that can only be seen when Baby returns back to the start of the game with the very last piece of ice cream. Just glad I don't have to slam her to a wall this time. Honestly, it's quite a squeeze with the time, but you're thankfully barely able to do it. And of course, when she gets there, she decides to turn this little girl into a meat pretzel. One aspect that I actually really like here is the music. Aptly named Turtle Crusher, wonder why, this is the first time we actually hear music that sounds a bit more like the minigame's general presentation, sounding a lot more cheerful than just faint thunder or a creepy music box. But by the time you retrieve the last piece of ice cream, the music abruptly slows down and becomes more muffled, which is something we will definitely see again. Leon Riskin, who started working with Scott during FNAF World's development, actually produced this track and would sort of become the series' main composer over time. Probably due to this, the majority of the other 8-bit minigames here would, from now on, include their very own specialized soundtracks. The other minigame for Sister Location being the end of night minigames for the game's custom night aren't even really minigames, they're kinda just cutscenes. But have a very similar style to the baby ones, being colorful, detailed, and definitely not Atari. Kinda like FNAF 3's post-night minigames, they all feature a loop of our player characters slowly decomposing over time as they take a stroll down their supposed neighborhood, featuring fairly normal reactions to Patient Zero, the zombie apocalypse. Which also gives us the return of the bald green shirt dude, who's basically a main character in his own right. The music here, as you'd imagine, sounds a lot like Turtle Crusher, but instead doesn't change in any way, shape, or form when revealing its more darker side, I guess. However, I will say, I think it does work in its favor here.
You know what? I think the happy song and time is over. Because, wow, that is horrifying.
FNAF 6, or Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, is probably the most interesting here. How many times have I said that by now? As some people genuinely thought this game was going to be a simple, well, Pizzeria Simulator, due to both Scott's comments, teasers about the game, and surprisingly even the intro to the game itself. Which, speaking of, the first few minutes include these same 8-bit graphics that we're all definitely accustomed to by now, at least I hope, and you didn't just get to this part of the video. While they maintain a similar appearance and gameplay, I guess, to FNAF 2, actually surprisingly similar, look, green shirt kid and all, they definitely have a few differences. Here, you're tasked with making your own pizza. Doesn't seem to really matter, though, and have to shovel them out for starving children for the sake of the company. However, your evil counterpart, Darth Freddy, has come to sabotage your world record for pizza throwing, and ultimately turn you to the dark side. And it seems there's really nothing you can do about it. For how lore-heavy this specific game in reality actually is, it's interesting that this is the first time an 8-bit minigame truly lacks any real lore relevance, or actually any importance to the series. Besides it probably confirming Scott's favorite pizza toppings, I don't know. Well, I'm not too sure of the in-universe explanation for something like this, if it really even matters. It's such an unforgettable moment in the series, at least for me, and further shows how jarring it can be switching from both gameplay styles, which Pizzeria Simulator as a whole does very well. Like with the security puppet minigame. Besides adding a lot more detail to a similar minigame seen in FNAF 2, I'm personally not the biggest fan of this one, at least visually. Everything's in grayscale besides a few choice colors for some reason. The slanted wall looks a bit odd, and don't even get me started on whatever's going on with the exit sign. I mean, you can't even really beat the minigame itself. But after all, it's a FNAF minigame, things obviously start to change. On the 4th round, you'll finally find the kid with the green bracelet. The cheerful music then stops, only playing a faint rain sound like in FNAF 3's minigames. Finally, putting the odd exit door to use, this sound gets a bit louder and even has little drops of rain bouncing off of the puppet itself, showing how severe the weather is outside. And you can tell this is outside because of the trash cans and posters littered about. I mean, there was also an exit sign. As the puppet gets closer to the girl, it begins to deteriorate, to the point where you're essentially crawling to the kid's slumped body, with clear tire tracks implying exactly what happened here. This minigame, to me, perfectly embodies the evolution of these minigames as a whole, even if it's not my personal favorite. While yes, it does miss some of that Atari aesthetic that kind of made these minigames in the first place, like I said before, this style has, at this point, cemented itself within the series. And this specific minigame uses basically all of those same elements here. This one, however, is a bit different. On the surface, Midnight Motorist is just a short racing game, but then delves into a nightmare for theorists. Glad I'm not one of those guys. But the racing minigame itself is admittedly pretty cool. It's got some killer music, is pretty fun in its own right, and offers a ton of money afterwards, which is a series first, having the minigames directly correspond to actual benefits in the main gameplay, not just a secret ending or even a jump scare. The presentation as well is much closer to FNAF World's first layer of the flip side than really anything else here. But, of course, that's not all. Because if you travel through a small opening on the bottom section of the track, just before finishing your last lap, you'll be taken to a road. Not only does the appearance of the entire minigame shift dramatically, but the gameplay does too. It's really not hard to see why this individual minigame is still being discussed to this day. There's multiple characters, dialogue, different fully colored guys, separate perspectives, I mean, it's literally got everything. The music even starts to slowly fade when approaching the player character's house, and even plays a different soundtrack when inside. The view looks different, sprites look different, I guess at least the rain's the same. There's sound effects for knocking, different paths that don't do anything, 2 sets of footprints that are so visually distinct I generally don't even know where to start. Concerning the evolution of these minigames, this one's obviously a bit weird. Outside of FNAF 4, Midnight Motorist, or I guess later that night from the files, is up there as one of the more complex minigames. But I'm assuming you probably already knew that. Fruity Maze, the name of the final 8-bit minigame in Pizza Sim, is again really cool. You play as a young girl with blonde hair, who has to collect different fruits and items in a certain amount of time inside a giant green maze. The player will quickly notice a reflection being cast upon the screen, being the face of a young girl with blonde hair, which is the first time we see a character like this that's not strangely pixelated. On round 2, the oranges are now replaced with dead dogs, the music is significantly slowed down, and the girl has tears in her eyes. Okay, a little shocking. On the 3rd round, the music has slowed down a lot now, the dog looks more decrepit, the other fruits have become flowers, and supposedly a coffin, with the girl, now known as Susie, shown with visible tear streaks and a giant yellow rabbit looming over her shoulder. This time, the minigame is completely unbeatable, as the upgrades no longer function correctly, which leads our iconic yellow rabbit to start talking to Susie. No, not that one. In almost every single regard, this one and FNAF 6 as a whole changes up how minigames actually work in the series. Instead of rare game over minigames or ones that happen after completing every night, we've got minigames that function as specific gameplay elements with their own secrets tucked inside. These all play with perspective, appearance, and change up how FNAF's story used to be told. They also kind of get rid of jump scares in each one, so, I mean, that's cool too. All around, game changing. So in Ultimate Custom Night, there's a minigame after setting only consequences to 1, where it's practically identical to FNAF World, except he actually talks to you this time. Drowning in the lake just crashes your game. Not much here, so... First appearing in Help Wanted's mobile port of all things, Princess Quest is a huge change up from FNAF's usual minigames. I mean, just look at it. Actually, pixel art. I started to think I would never see the day. Seriously though, that alone makes these series of minigames so much more visually distinct alongside the others. Here, the gameplay is more reminiscent of dungeon crawlers, rather than really anything else seen before in previous titles. The princess, only aided by a lantern, needs to traverse through this dark dungeon and avoid the roaming rabbit manifestations scattered around, because they bite. Along the way, she can find hearts that give her more health, torch spots that give further access to the dungeons, keys that unlock doors, and of course more weird rabbit things. What's interesting here is how this was just included in the first place. As I said before, this didn't release alongside the main game, actually being shown in Help Wanted's mobile port that was released about a year after the original release of the game. The only way to access it, it seems, is by zooming in and out over and over anywhere in the hub world. At least this is one way to unlock it, and also unlocks every single playable minigame here, so yeah. When Security Breach released, Princess Quest had now turned into 3 arcade cabinets that were spread around the Pizzaplex. While Princess Quest 1 remained virtually the same, beside a few sprite changes here and there, Princess Quest's sequel changed things up quite a bit. Instead of being unable to defend herself, the princess is now granted the Sword of Light, and is able to attack those same pesky rabbits, and I guess a new one too. We're also able to somehow expel our shadow, and use that to further explore the dungeon. Overall, just generally a step up gameplay-wise from the last one. However, I mean, where's the existing FNAF elements? Almost everything I mentioned previously that became a staple to the series' usual minigame formula are basically completely absent here. No Atari aesthetic, weird sprites, post-night function, etc. I mean, there's no CRT filter, like, at all. Now, there's RPG elements, correct pixelization for everything here, and not to mention, these are only playable after physically finding them around the Pizzaplex. Really, the only semblance of FNAF, at least visually, is with the end of Princess Quest 2, which puts the player inside the first game's office. This is where Princess Quest 3 starts, and remains pretty much the same as the second one, besides venturing through a torn version of Help Wanted's hub world, Grim Foxy's corn maze, and Chica's... airport? One thing I'll add is that the music for all 3 minigames are the exact same, being called Caught in a Loop. Funny. Just like the first 2, the princess has to collect items to eventually escape, which results in definitely the best ending possible in the game, kinda like FNAF 3. But that's pretty much where the similarities end. The whole line of Princess Quest titles is definitely a weird one, especially when discussing how these minigames eventually evolved, since this one's like so completely different from everything else here. It's clear that Security Breach wanted to differentiate itself from past games while keeping a few of the series' elements intact. But here, it's as if everything was kind of thrown out for, in turn, a more enjoyable minigame experience. And by that, I mean instead of prioritizing the confirmation of like a misunderstood story detail, Princess Quest sets out to offer, well, an actual minigame that when completed awards the player with like the best possible ending. Simple as that. Another arcade machine that can be found in the Pizzaplex is Balloon World, specifically in the secret room accessed in the daycare's theater. As Balloon Boy, you have to stay suspended in the air while avoiding things like barrels, trees, birds, the sun. Can't really avoid that though. It's essentially Flappy Bird. But your supply of balloons can be replenished from finding a few scattered about around the forest. Which, why are we in a forest? However, if the player stumbles upon a small purple glitch, of course, and runs into it, they'll be transported to a glitchy hellscape. Along with an abrupt music change, following this purple-coated path results in a long staring contest with Sun. Other than that, not much else to it. Just like Princess Quest, this minigame features correct pixel art, with maybe a few size differences, but everything is nicely done. While it's hard to compare this to like other consoles, I'd say its appearance leans more towards the SNES more than really anything else, with its brighter colors and simplistic gameplay style. Oh, and almost forgot to mention Chica's Feeding Frenzy, of course, such a memorable one for sure. This minigame, which was mentioned and even seen in Security Breach itself, somehow actually works in its DLC, Ruin. It's not too hard to find, but oh man, is it hard to beat. Here you play as Glamrock Chica, who has to suffer through 20 waves of children, security guards, and map bots. After completing 20 waves, yes, 20, you're awarded with Chica's voice box, which, no joke, doesn't actually do anything. You can give it to her in a cutscene, but that's really it. While its overall inclusion is pretty strange, the presentation here is, well, it's also pretty strange. A lot of the sprites are so small in game, but for some reason are incredibly detailed, except for like any facial features, which makes every kid just end up looking like a Slender Man. The overlay is kind of hard to look at, the texts are inconsistent, almost everything here is just really weird. Which also means that out of all the arcade machines seen throughout the entirety of Security Breach, only 5 are actually playable. But then Help Wanted 2 came out, and surprise, surprise, there's actually a 4th Princess Quest cabinet. However, since this game is completely in VR, they changed things up a bit. It'll take a while to get there, but eventually after collecting all 6 of the weird memory doll thingies and using a purple fast token on the machine itself, you'll be transported in front of a functional Princess Quest 4. Since you're in VR, of course, the princess is controlled with a joystick here. You have the same sword and use teleportation to get around. It's a bit finicky, but you know, it works. After going through a short course, you gain a key which unlocks the actual room that you, as the player, are currently in, which is a really cool moment, I'll add. Taking the sword from the machine itself, you, yes you, are now actually the one in Princess Quest in a first-person perspective. The minigame itself is practically the same as the other ones, at least the same gameplay, just, you know, with a bit of a different view. But the only enemy type here is the standard floating head one, and there's no usage of the princess's shadow. Visually, however, it's really cool to see how the pixelization of the minigames were transferred into a 3D space. While not everything here is pixelated, Steel definitely went out of their way to portray the game as close to the version seen in Security Breach. The music here also feels like a more modern take on the original score, named gracefully Into the Abyss, with everything here creating such a memorable section of, in my opinion, the entire series. But what if you were to have a FNAF game completely developed in a style like this, being a completely pixelated game that borrows elements seen all around the series? Yes, even with Princess Quest. Well, that did actually happen recently. Into the Pit, I must admit, it's just a fantastic game all around. First and foremost, the entire approach to this game is adapting the Fazbear Fright story Into the Pit, again, into a fully fledged video game experience. However, this looks a little bit different from your typical FNAF game. Well, that's because Mega Cat Studios, a video game development studio who specializes in making retro-style games to PCs, current consoles, and even actual cartridges, developed this one. Due to this, the whole game features pixel art designs on practically everything, from its characters, locations, animatronics, cutscenes, spiders, paper pals, trapped rats, skee-ball balls, ball pits, wooden balls, etc. There's a lot of balls, which all culminates in a fresh and exciting retelling of the first Fazbear Fright story. However, this seemingly wasn't even supposed to initially be the intended look of the game. Remember when I mentioned Mega Cat Studios making games that could be played on actual retro console cartridges? Well, hidden inside the contents of the game's Switch and PC versions are loads of sprites for different characters, locations that would have taken place on the SNES. Yes, like the actual Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which I'm sure made Scott Cawthon giddy.
So if I could make something that would come on the Super Nintendo cartridge, you know, sign me up. That was the most exciting thing, the most exciting product I'd ever worked on.
It's super cool and would have made this evolution video pretty neat if this was the actual intended look for the game. But for some reason, probably for just general accessibility, it's not, at least right now. In the game itself, going back to the PC release, there are a few arcade cabinets that are actually playable in the arcade section of both the past and the present. We're first introduced to a skee ball-like minigame that's pretty easy to cheese after a while. From then on, there's a Frogger-like minigame, something akin to Asteroids, a Space Invaders one, hefting with Helpules, a god-awful puzzle minigame, and a couple more. The first one being named Rescue the Children, in which BB is tasked with collecting 4 separately spaced kids and delivering them through one of 4 different doors. However, after getting the first child, Spring Bunny will emerge and attempt to take these kids if he gets too close. The general appearance here matches much more to something like Pac-Man than really anything else. The last one, being named Collect the Hats, is far more interesting, however. You play as Balloon Boy again, he's in a lot of these, with the exact same sprite from the last minigame, and are tasked with obtaining 5 party hats. Looking a lot like BB's Air Adventure from FNAF 3, but this time you'll have to dodge cannonballs and use moving platforms to collect each one. But for keen players, me, not to brag. You think there's like a secret? You know what? This is a weird spot. Oh. Where am I? We'll notice a strange platform that doesn't really lead to anything, at least at first. If it's a Five Nights at Freddy's minigame, there's always a secret door somewhere. Running past the 2 party rooms will lead you to Purple Guy, who is seen holding the last obtainable party hats. Honestly, he looks pretty weird when built in actual pixel art like this. Not only is this the only minigame in the arcade with a secret like this, but it's also really the only one here that seems to be a direct callback to a previous minigame in the series. Other than that, and some of the inconsistent sizes of pixelated items, doors, or characters of these games, which is not a first, there's not really much else to it. Good thing there's a few more though. That's right, hidden inside the contents of Into the Pit are 3 secret minigames, with very strange requirements for each one. The first one can only be done by getting enough tickets to redeem all 3 stickers and an extra voucher from the voucher machine and going back to the past to redeem it. First impressions are... well, this looks a tad familiar. This one, based on the Fazbear Fright story, Fetch, takes heavy inspiration from both the Save Them minigame from FNAF 2, notice the Golden Freddy sprite, and the Post-Night minigames from FNAF 3 as Greg's sprite. Here, all you have to do is collect 6 balloons and deliver them all to Fetch, which looks more like a 2000s robot dog toy than his usual appearance, but this is definitely supposed to be him. Here, however, as you'd likely notice, the secret minigame uses Scott Cawthon's classic pixelization style seen in basically every game in the main series, rather than the traditional pixel art seen in, you know, the actual game. In fact, all the secret minigames here do. The second one, being based on To Be Beautiful in Fazbear Frights, has Eleanor granting Sarah's wish of being beautiful, which can only be activated upon calling Oz's mom during the 5th night of the game. The last minigame, being based yet again on another Fazbear Fright story, Count the Ways, follows Millie repeatedly entering the room adjacent to her until she stumbles upon Bonbon. I think at least. Which is only obtainable by interacting with the gumball machine like 83 times. I did say there was a lot of balls. All of these seem to be inspired, at least gameplay-wise, to one of the 4 FNAF 2 minigames, with, again, Fetch being Save Them, To Be Beautiful being Give Gifts, Give Life, and Count the Ways being Foxy Go Go Go. So, what's really going on here? Well, without considering what this necessarily does to the overarching lore, I believe this is more of an homage of sorts to these classic minigames and stories. All 3 of these are chronologically the oldest Fazbear Fright stories in the series, besides Into the Pit of course. Mix that with making these minigames heavily based on FNAF 2's minigames, which are also the oldest minigames in the series, and you've got 3 fun callbacks for older fans. One strange thing here, however, is that I believe none of these are explicitly called out by the game or given any clues for their whereabouts, like, whatsoever. Which is especially strange when they seem to be required to unlock the 3-star ending. Again, using minigames for the best possible ending in a FNAF game, which is really only a post-credit scene. Interestingly, even more cut content suggested a few more minigames in this same style, including characters like Vanny, surprisingly, taking on a more FNAF 3 inspired design. And she just looks so goofy, I can't take her seriously. There's even a new Purple Guy sprite, which there sure are a lot of these now. Though it is funny how we've basically gone full circle now, with the sprite based on FNAF 2's look, emulating the style of FNAF 3 while also being completely original. Huh. And for games, well, that's pretty much it. I was going to include a small segment concerning the intro to the film, as it obviously intends to emulate that same minigame style from earlier games, but overall I think it stands more as a testament to how important this visual design is to the series as a whole. For it to be the main stand-in for how the missing children's incident is portrayed in the game's official movie almost parallels how the minigames function in the games, as getting key information across to the player with unforgettable graphics, even if they're not the best looking. For about 10 whole years now, these minigames have cemented themselves as such a recognizable part of the Five Nights at Freddy's series. While most people focus more intently on the information trying to be conveyed to the player, I always had a soft spot for how these minigames were actually designed. Like I said in the beginning, it's such a unique way to develop a story, and was for the most part unheard of before the release of FNAF 2. With the next game in the series seemingly taking place all the way back in the 70s, I'd love to see how they go about developing even more minigames like this in the future. Just maybe hold off on a few more purple guy sprites. I've been collecting them for a while, and I'm kind of running out of room. Definitely missing one though.